Hi, welcome to session 18. Let's look at what we learned this session. We talked about chord melody. We learned about major seventh chords, minor seventh chords, and even into ninth chords and the chord forms that go with them. We also learned 3 different ways to jazz up chord progressions. This session is about jazz, one of my favorite subjects, so we have to get into all these extra chords. We also learned the theory behind ninths, 11ths, and 13ths. That wraps up our chord spelling exercises with all this diatonic stuff. So you have conquered it once we get through 13ths. The most important skills I need for you to come away from this session are to learn these new chord forms, understand the concepts of embellishing chords, understand the chord movement substitutions that we talked about, adding the 2-5, adjusting the dominant, all those things. And also, the most important thing I need you to learn out of this theory-wise is the ability to spell 9th chords, 11th chords, and 13th chords. Okay, let's talk about chord melody. A chord melody involves playing a melody with chords with the melody note as the highest tone in your chord voicing, and all the other notes voiced beneath that melody note, something we do in jazz all the time. Remember the 2 examples we did in the book on page 93? Let's take a look at those, and let me talk you through those. The first one there, we have a simple melody. So that's my given melody. Now I have to try and put chords underneath that to make it sound a little bit more jazzy. So I have the chord forms written in there, and I came up with... So it's basically a C major 7th tonality. I use that first C major 7th, just goes back a half step, so I did the whole thing on the chord. And then I jump up to one of my favorite minor 7th chords, which, by the way, has almost the exact same notes as a C major 7th. Just with that added D, that would be, I guess, a C major 9th. Let's look at that second example. What's that melody? Well, it goes... If I add the chords to that, now those 2 chords I was jumping between are a C and an F major 7th, with some variations in there. C major 7th went to our 6th-string form of our major 7th. Let me give you one other example, and there are more examples in the bonus workshop exercises for session 18. These and many other resources are available to you online at learnandmasterguitar.com/resources. This is from the chord melody bonus exercises. We're not going to go through all of them, but let's take a look at number 1. So here is just the plain melody. Okay, very typical little jazz phrase as we come out of a song. One more time, that melody is. Ready? Go. Threw a couple little slides in there, make it sound a little bit more jazzy. Now let's throw some chords on that. The chords that go with that, it's a typical 2-5-1 or D minor 7th, G to a C. Well, let's think about it. I'm going to talk you through this for a second. I got to hit this note. Well, do I know any minor 7th forms? Well, here's the closest D minor 7th form. If I put my pinky down, I can catch that high note. And then if I take my pinky off, well, look, there's that A. What about that G? How do I do that? Well, I don't know a D minor. I mean, I could do a 11th form, but that's going to be a little hard to grab. So I might just do a little single note there. Then I have a G 13th, because I'm going to that G 7th, so I kind of dolled it up a little bit with that G 13th, because that E is not in a G 7th chord, although the tonality is G 7, so I have to make it work. Same thing with the C there. So I'll do a little G 11th there. Now I come to this little lick. Well, that's pretty tough to play that with all my G chords. I guess I could do that. That's a little awkward, though. So I'm going to do a little trick that I'll explain after I play it. I'm going to kind of slide up to it. Let me play that for you. So the whole lick would be... See, this is C6 right there. We haven't learned that form yet, but there it is. One more time, I'll do it slow. 2, ready, go. Now, you notice on the G13th, I didn't play the whole chord. I just played 3 notes of it. Then I did that little slide there. Now, what is that? Well, let me tell you about that. That is kind of a triad use of a scale. This one uses a little concept that I learned from a great jazz guitarist when I was taking lessons back in Texas. His name was Jack Skiles. He was probably 80 years old when I was taken from him. I was in high school, a teenager, and thought I knew it all. And I was a little too hip to get into what he was teaching me at that time. Now, I would relish the time if I could go back and learn from him. He's long since passed away. And he was the only teacher in my whole life that canceled me for lessons. He said, "You obviously don't have enough time to do what I need you to do, so why don't you come back when you have some time to do it?" I always remember Jack. He was a pretty straightforward kind of a guy. He was the only one that ever said that to me. And I had my head in the wrong place at that time. But I remember what he showed me. He talked to me about a simple way to look at chords by relating them to the C major scale. He took a C major scale, and he put triads underneath it. This is a C triad, D minor. Remember that harmonized major scale we talked about several sessions back? F, G, A. Now here he changed it a little bit. We did kind of a G7 form, and then C. These are my Jack Skiles triads. That was kind of the way he played, kind of an old-timey way of playing jazz. It's very interesting, fun now. Howard Roberts, a lot of these guys played that way. That's all they're doing. It's a triad, 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 F, G, F, kind of a G7th. And do another keys. Let me show you some keys that I've found when trying to develop a chord melody. This is stuff that jazz players do all the time. Usually jazz music is just a lead sheet with a melody and chords on top, and you have to try and make that sound like a real song. Here's the first key. Voice the appropriate chord with the melody note on top. It says a D minor 7th, and it's got a C note. Remember how we did that in the example? I got to try and voice that chord correctly. So I can't have a C chord there with that note there, or an A minor 7th. It's got to be the D minor 7th. Second thing, try to get as many melody note possibilities out of each chord form. Let's just take this D minor 7th here. Well, how many different melody notes can I get out of that? Well, I can reach the C, I can reach the A, G, there's F, there's E. I can do the D, but I start losing the tonality of the chord. Wow, I can almost get a whole scale out of that one chord. So anytime I have a D minor 7th chord or any minor 7th chord with a tonality note that is in the key, I just wobble my pinky around until I get to the right note. Kind of doing a claw thing with my hand down here. You can play with your pick too. Okay, here's another little trick. use the fourth chord when nothing else is possible. Wait, I know you're saying, what is that? Okay, let me tell you about this little trick. There's a chord that's built in fourths. Like here we are in C. There's a C. Fourth below that is a G. Fourth below that is a D. Fourth below that's an A. So it's just all stacked fourths. It's kind of an ambiguous chord. It's neither major or minor. If I transposed it to a different set of strings, I end up with this form up here. Same notes, just different place. See how that's the same chord? Now, since this chord is so ambiguous, I can do it in several different, I can use it in several different scenarios. Like if I had my melody, let's say that was my melody, and I didn't know what chords to do with it, I could cheat and use my little fourth chord. Sounds like I have some really hip jazz progression happening. All I'm doing is dancing around on these fourth chords. Now, when a fourth chord doesn't sound correct, another little trick, when doing chord melody stuff, just go back to jazz octaves. Remember we covered jazz octaves? I believe it was in session 15 or so. I can play those with my pick, or I can also do my third finger. Remember how I talked about that? I'm just hitting them with the back of my finger, back of my nail, just lightly. Now, if your chord melody even gets too fast for jazz octaves, just play the single note. See, I just played those two single notes. Just played those two single notes because it's just too fast to do that. Now, we covered several new chord forms in your book, and there are exercises in the bonus resources giving you some practice with all these new jazz chord forms. So I won't cover that again here because we did that pretty well in the presentation. But let's move on to ways to jazz up chord progressions. We learned 3 ways to jazz up chord progressions. There are several others. I'm going to give you some resources here in a minute to tell you more ways to learn about that. But here are the ones that we covered. We talked about adding color tones, adding a 2-5 progression between chords, and we talked about dressing up the dominant 7th chord. Let's get some practice with adding some color tones. Make sure that the color tones that you're adding to whatever your chord is are in the key of the song. Very important. That's your one rule with adding color tones. So if I'm in the C and let's say I have a D minor chord, well, I can add all kinds. I can make that a D minor 9th, a D minor 11th. All that works because that F and G is in the key of C. But let's say I'm in the key of C and I have an E minor chord. Well, that's great. I can add the E minor 7th. I could do the 11th, but I can't do the 9th because that puts that F sharp. And if I'm in the key of C, that F sharp is going to sound funny. So the only thing is I have to just make sure as I'm adding color tones to various chords that I don't go out of my key, or that's going to start sounding bad. Let's get a couple of examples of this. These are from the Adding Color Tones bonus exercises. Let's take a look at number 1. The original progression, we're in the key of B flat. So the original progression was a B flat to a G minor to a C minor to an F. Man, how boring can that be? A good jazz player would never play that. When I see that B flat, I would maybe go a B flat major 7th. When I see that G minor, I'd probably do maybe a G minor 7th. See that C minor, I wouldn't play a C minor, I'd play maybe a C minor 11th. That F9, instead of the F, I would do probably an F9 maybe. Now look at that, if I voice them right, B flat major 7 with the F on top, G minor 7th, still have the F on top, C minor 11th, I still have the F on top, and then if I did the C 9th, the F 9th, then I got to go to the G. But if I wanted to keep that F down there, what could I do? I could do maybe that one. That's kind of an F 13th, and that way I have my melody note the same. That's how jazz players think of that. Let's go to exercise number 2. I have an E flat chord, F minor, G minor, and an A flat. Very common progression, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in that key, the key of E flat. Well, if I was playing jazz, maybe I'd do an E flat major 9th. Some of these forms may be unfamiliar to you, but the chord shapes are written in your in the bonus exercises. F minor 9th, maybe G minor 13th, or excuse me, G minor 11th, and maybe an A flat major 13th. Real hip things. Let's see what that sounds like. Wow, suddenly I sound real hip. All I did was add color tones to these chords. Second way we can do to spice up our progressions is adding a 2-5 progression. Now I'm adding some chords in between some different chords. Remember, we can always add the 2-5 progression in the key of the chord that we are going to. It doesn't have to be the key of the song. The key of the chord that we're going to, either major or minor. This works quite well in many situations. Let's get a couple examples of this. These are from the adding the 2-5 bonus exercises. Let's take a look at number 1 of that. Well, the original progression is B flat major 7, then E flat major 7th. Pretty standard 1 to 4 progression. Now if I wanted to jazz that up, maybe I'd do the B flat major 7th. But now I'm going to throw in the key of E flat, which is the chord I'm going to, I'm going to give a 2-5. Well, what's the 2 chord in E flat? That'd be F minor. What's the 5 chord in E flat? Well, that would be B flat. So I'm adding an F minor and a B flat to it. We can even dress those up a little bit. Maybe an F minor 7th and a B flat 7 before we hit that E flat major 7. Then look what happens in that 4th bar. I'm going to do a 2-5 to get us back to the B flat major 7. So let's play all of that. This is adding the 2-5 progression number 1. Ready, go. B flat major 7th, F minor 7th, B flat 7th, E flat major 7th, C minor 7th, F9, B flat major 7th. Now let's do number 2. That one is a regular 1 to 6 minor progression in G, going to an E minor. Very, very uninteresting for a jazz player. A jazz player wouldn't be able to sit through that. Wouldn't leave those alone. So we'll do a G major 7th, of course, on the major form. Now, we're going to a minor chord, that's 6 minor. Well, in the key of E, the 2 would be F sharp, and the 5 would be a B. But for minor chords, instead of doing just a minor, I'm going to do a minor 7th, or a half diminished. Think of it that way. So I'm going to do when going to a minor chord, you do a half diminished to the 5. So if in that progression, I'd have a G major 7th. Then I'd have this F sharp half diminished, B7, then E minor 7th. Now regular 2-5 into G. So I start up here. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. If I wanted to jazz that up even more, let's see what I could do. I could do all of those. I just messed around with different color tones in there. The third way, the last way that we looked at dressing up these chords is we're messing with that dominant. That's the 5 chord. I can always add, it's like a Christmas tree. I can always add things to the dominant chord, and it hardly ever is going to screw you up. I can add the 9th. I can add the 11th. I can add the 13th. I can add the sharp 5, the flat 5. All that stuff I can do to the dominant. Let's take a look at number 1, dressing up the dominant bonus exercises. Okay, this is number 1. Regular A minor 7th, D7, and a G major 7th. Good standard 2-5 progression in key of G. Well, a jazz player would do maybe an A minor 9th, which is a new form, which is just an A minor, but I'm adding my pinky down here on the 9th. Maybe a D 9th, G major 7th, then an E ninth, do a little 5 back to that A minor 7th. So I end up, what did I do? I dressed up that dominant, that D7, I turned him into a D ninth. E ninth. Let's take a look at the second one. Add some minor chords into this. Let's go to the key of A. We have a B minor 7th to an E to an A. I'm going to turn that into a B minor 9th again. Maybe an E 13th to an A major 7th. And look, I'm trying to get back to a minor chord, that B minor, so I'm going to do the 2 half diminished and even the altered 5 going to that B minor. With the C sharp, half diminished, F sharp, augmented. Put that all together, sounds like... Now I got some pretty hip sounding progressions. Let's get into theory world for a little bit and talk about ninths, 11ths, and 13ths. A ninth chord just adds another third on top of our 7th chord that we learned. We had 3 types of ninth chords: major ninths, minor ninths, and dominant ninths. Now, well, why don't we have augmented ninths and diminished ninths? Well, really the only ones you were going to see are those 3 types: major ninth, minor ninth, and dominant ninth. Let's talk about major ninths first. A major ninth chord is made up of the what? The 1st, the 3rd, the 5th. Uh-oh, what kind of 7th? Did it say the magic word? Yes, it said major, so it's a regular 7th, 1, 3, 5, 7, and now I just slap that 9 on top. 9, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. The 1st, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, and 9th step of any major scale. For example, if I wanted a major ninth chord in the key of C, it would have a C, E, G, B, and a D in it. If I was in the key of A flat, an A flat major ninth, what's the formula? 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Couldn't get any easier. But now I have to just plug in those notes from an A flat major scale. I end up with A flat, C, E flat, G, and a B flat. That's major ninths. Let's talk about the second one, minor ninths. Well, what is each part of that name telling us? Minor, that's telling us triad information. That's the 1 flat 3 5 part of it. Did it say the magic word, major? Nope. So that means it's a flatted 7th, 1 flat 3 5 flat 7, and I just slap that 9th on the top of it. For example, if I wanted a C minor ninth, it would be C, E flat, G, regular minor triad, B flat, and D. So put that all together, C, E flat, G, B flat, and D. If I was an F minor ninth would be, think of it, 1 flat 3 5 flat 7 and 9, F, A flat, C, E flat, and G. Now the third type is a dominant ninth chord. A dominant ninth chord is made up of the 1st, the 3rd, the 5th, the flatted 7th, and the 9th. So when these chords are labeled, these dominant chords, they drop the word dominant and just say 9, just like we did with the 7th. So it's like an F9, G9. These are the chords we're talking about. For example, if I wanted a C ninth, it would be C, E, G, C major triad, B flat, that's that flatted 7th, and then a D on top. If I was an A ninth would be A, C sharp, E, G, and B. Now there are other types of ninth chords, but these are primarily what you're going to see, those 3 types. Let's move on. Let's go to 11ths. There are 2 types of these that you're going to commonly see, a minor 11th and a dominant 11th. Let's talk about the minor 11th first. A minor 11th chord is made up of the 1st, the flat 3rd, the 5th, minor. What kind of 7th? Flatted 7th, because it didn't say the magic word. We have the 9th and we have the 11th. See how they're kind of stacking up on each other. For example, a C minor 11th would be C, E flat, and G, B flat, D, and F. Now, I'm sure by now you're starting to think, well, I only have 6 strings and 5 fingers, and so I'm going to start getting more notes than my fingers can be able to manage. So let me talk about choosing notes. What notes are important? Well, if it's an 11th chord, chances are that 11th is pretty important, or they wouldn't have told you to put it in there. So you got to leave that in there. You generally have to leave the 3rd in, because because that determines whether it's major or minor. You got to leave the 7th in, because that determines whether it's a major 7th or a minor 7th. Or excuse me, a major 7th, normal 7, or a flatted 7. So I got the 3rd, the 7th, and then I've got my color tone, which is the 11th. Well, Steve, isn't the 1, isn't that like the most important note of the chord? Really? Not really. In the actual playing it, I'm generally playing in a jazz trio or something, and there's a bass player, and his only job is to play the root of the chord. So chances are everybody else in the whole band is playing the root of the chord. So if I want to give the color, I give the 3rd, I give the 7th, and I give the color tone. So if I need to start dropping notes, I can start dropping the 5th, unless there's something happening with it. It's augmented or diminished or something. And I can generally drop the root. If I was in B, a B minor 11th would be B, D, F sharp, A, C sharp, and E. That 9th is still in an 11th chord. In theory world, it very much still is in there. Let's talk about a dominant 11th chord. A dominant 11th chord is made up of the 1st, 3rd, and 5th, flatted 7th, 9th, and 11th. Easy as can be. Now, but here's the trick. Generally, in a dominant 11th chord, like a C 11th, F 11th, the 3rd is omitted. In theory world, it is in there, but in actual playing practicality of it, you take the 3rd out. So, for example, a C 11th would be C, E, but I'm not going to play it, G, B flat, D, and an F. So actually, the only notes I'm worried about are C, G, B flat, D, and an F. If I was in B flat, a B flat 11th would be B flat, D, but I'm going to drop it, then F, A flat, C, and E flat. One last type. You still with me? 13th chords. There are 3 different types of these that we will commonly see in guitar world, and in jazz particularly. A major 13th, a minor 13th, and a dominant 13th. The rules work the same here as the others. Major triad, minor triad. Does it have a major 7th in it? It says the word major. And there's plenty of worksheets in the bonus resources, so I'm not going to give you much practice on that right now. There's plenty of worksheets there to help you out with these as well as the answer keys. So there you have it. We have conquered diatonic chord spelling. The only thing we have left to do is mess with these different notes and sharp the 5 and sharp the 9 and flat the 5, that sort of thing. Okay, before we go, I wanted to mention a few resources to you that I didn't get a chance to mention in the presentation. These are some books that have opened up the world of jazz and jazz harmony to me. You can get these online or possibly order them from your local music store. The first is Creative Chord Substitution for Jazz Guitar by Eddie Arkin. It is published by Alfred Publishing. I got a version of it probably 20 years ago. It now has a new cover on it, but this book, more than any other, has opened up the world of jazz harmony and theory to me. It is written from a guitar player's perspective. Usually you see these theory books from a keyboard perspective. This one's written from a guitar perspective. There are tons of great forms given. I used to have a notebook, and I would write down each new form so I could learn it and put it in other situations. But all these chord forms are given in the context of using them in a real chord progression. One of the most helpful books I've ever seen. I have an older version. Cover is different from that now, but look for that, Creative Chord Substitution by Eddie Arkin. A second book I would encourage you to get is called Edley's Music Theory for Practical People by Ed Roseman. I have looked at tons of music theory books, even studied tons of music theory books in college and everything like that. This is the easiest to understand book of practical, real-world music theory that I have run across. A lot of times music theory books get so esoteric and just not stuff you actually have to deal with. This is a great book. It is the real nuts and bolts of the music theory that every musician needs to know to play music in their normal daily music playing. It's presented in a fun and simple to read and easy to understand format. Next one, if you want to really dive into soloing and jazz improvisation, it's called The Goal Note Method, Goal, G-O-A-L, The Goal Note Method by Shelton Berg. It's published by Lou Fisher Music Publishing. It's a thick book. This is a comprehensive approach to jazz soloing. It's a big book, delves into some serious soloing concepts. but I found it to be a very helpful resource in understanding soloing in general and jazz in particular. If you've got a real thirst for that, this book will take you through all the jazz theory that you're going to need to know. Lastly, you can't call yourself a jazz musician until you own at least one copy of the real book. It is published by Hal Leonard Corporation. It is a collection of jazz standards written in a simple lead sheet format. Jazz standards are just the songs that have defined jazz over the decades. And you have the single note melody at the top with the chord changes. That's all it has. If you have yourself a real book and a black suit, then you can play jazz clubs for the rest of your life. I never go to play a jazz gig to this day without my real book. My real book has seen more smoky jazz clubs than I can remember. It is all tore up with the pages coming out of it. I got the small version of it because I thought it was real cute. But now, as I'm getting older and the clubs are getting darker, it's difficult to see all the notes. I almost wish I would have gotten a big one since then. The real book has been around for 2 or 3 decades. They used to be an unpublished and rather under-the-table kind of a transaction, and it was made in order to get one. When I was in music school, you didn't go to a store to buy a real book. You knew somebody who sold them out of his trunk. That's how you used to be able to get real books. But I remember one day at the end of jazz ensemble rehearsal at college, some man that I've never seen before or since came in, laid out about 30 real books on the floor in the back of the band hall, and just stood there. And after rehearsal, everybody went up. We paid him in cash, and that's how I got my first one. But now they're fully legal and published by Hal Leonard, and you can pick them up at almost any music store. Let me also mention some players to listen to for jazz. Take a listen to Joe Pass, pretty much the defining voice of jazz guitar of that era. Wes Montgomery, jazz octaves. Howard Roberts is another one. These are just 3 of many great jazz guitarists. But they're a good place to start to learn about jazz guitar. Let me encourage you for a little bit. I started playing jazz in jam sessions when I was 15 years old. Me and a friend of mine, Arnold, would sneak out to a little hole-in-the-wall jazz club in San Antonio, Texas, where I grew up. And we would listen to a wonderful jazz duo called Small World. They're still playing to this day. Kyle Keener played drums and sang, and Polly Harrison played the 7th-string guitar, had an extra low 7th string on it, and she would do walking bass lines with her feet on pedals like you have on a keyboard organ. Just fascinating. And we would sit in the corner and order our sodas and watch the city's finest jazz musicians filter through this little club on their jam session nights. Occasionally they would come by and talk to us, and they invited us to play, just like they invited everybody to play, on their Sunday night jam sessions where anyone could come up and play. I was petrified my first time. Don't remember what we played, but I know how inexperienced and dumb I felt next to these great players. Later that night in the car, I would be depressed about how bad I thought I sounded. And for some people, that is just where they stop. They hear great players or play with great players, and they feel that their own playing is so bad, they just give up. They get depressed, and they just want to give up. But if you could turn that bad feeling into fuel to practice with, then those experiences will make you grow as a player like nothing else will. Don't let fear hold you back from playing with people that are better than you. My band director in high school took me into his office one day and said, "The more you play with good musicians, the better you will be." I've played in all kinds of situations with some of the best musicians on the planet, and I found that to be true in every playing situation I found myself in. So I would encourage you, look for places and people to play with. Don't let fear stop you from learning from players that are better than you. Lesser musicians cower back from those times, but real musicians lean into those times and learn all that they can. Keep up the great work. Thanks for letting me be a part of your learning process. It's an honor to serve you guys in this way. I'll see you next time. Here's a couple of tips to learning this material that we've covered in this jazz session. First, learn the new chord forms. Some of those are already familiar to you, that we learned back when we were covering some of these major seventh chord forms, the open ones. But now we're getting into the movable ones, these minor seventh chord forms, these ninth chords. Even in some of the examples here, I've introduced some other chords, some different minor ninths and movable minor elevenths and things like that. Learn these chord forms. Second thing, experiment with the chord substitutions, these different ways of jazzing up your chord progressions. Take a look at some of the music that's in the book, or buy yourself a real book and look at that and try and figure out these 2/5 progressions, these different ways of jazzing it up. Last thing is listen to some great jazz guitar players. I'm not going to be able to cover all of jazz guitar in a 30-minute lesson. It just doesn't work that way. I've given you some pointers, given some things that I do, but you need to learn from some of the greats. Keep up the great work. For this session, you're ready to move on when you have learned all of the new forms that I introduced in this session, the major sevenths and the ninths and the minor sevenths, and you're ready to move on when you've completed all of the chord spelling worksheets in the bonus resources as well. You're going to need every bit of help on those that you can get. When you've done these two huge tasks, then you can move on to the next session where we're going to be talking about soloing. It's a great session. You've done great work this session. We'll see you there.